Welcome to the latest episode of You Should Read This, here again with Tom van der Lubbe. And in this episode, we will be tackling the book, The Fearless Organization, subtitled Creating Psychological Safety in the Workplace for Learning, Innovation and Growth by Amy Edmondson. Amy, in fact, appeared on the Being Human on the Being Human podcast. And yeah, it was great to go into some depths with the book with her in that show, episode 81. For those new to this, and if you want to check that out, we'll put a link in the show notes to that. But for those new to this, psychological safety is being able to show and employ oneself without fear of negative consequences of self-image, status, or career. I'll read that again. Psychological safety is being able to show and employ oneself without fear of negative consequences of self-image, status, or career. And that was a definition written by William Kahn in 1990, which I'm taking straight from Wikipedia. This is a kind of deep dive into what we mean by psychological safety, where Amy herself has observed this in different companies. What are the benefits of psychological safety, and how at least we as leaders, is the question she really answers, can encourage psychological safety in our organizations. So that's what we'll take a tour of in this episode. The book itself is split into three parts. The first is the power of psychological safety. The second is psychological safety at work. And the third is creating what she calls a fearless organization. So that's what we'll be doing in the next sort of 45 minutes or so. Is there anything you'd like to open with, Tom?
Yeah, I think we should explain why Amy Edmondson became so famous.
Right.
And where is the link to business? And I would like to refer, but you can also add on that. There has been research done by Google, and it's called the Aristotle Project. And they found out that, they wanted to do research on team performance or performance and comparing the different teams. And to cut a long story short, the conclusion was that teams where there was psychological safety, and you just explained what it was, were doing much better. So what was the conclusion? If you want to boost your team performance, typical American way of framing the whole stuff, how can you maximize your output? Oh, we should have a safe environment. That's more or less what they found out. And then they started to search. Those intelligent guys at Google, they search and they invite people, Google Talks, etc. So they know where to find the research. And they found Amy Edmondson. And then since then, there has been an enormous amount of articles, and this hashtag psychological safety refers to this whole, let's say, environment or topic, so to say.
Yeah. That's why it's so relevant. And I think we all know it, right? I mean, when I think about the most successful teams I've been in, I mean, one of the ways that she refers to psychological safety in the book is this idea of candor. The teams where, you feel like you've, when I just think back to, a project I worked on, a digital project, we were developing one of the very first digital marketplaces in the UK. Yeah, we all felt like we were contributing. We could all speak up. We could criticize each other, but it also felt kind of vaguely warm and sort of warm and respectful enough that we felt like we were getting on with each other, and that, it just feels good. I think when you're in that bubble of sort of respect, right? We all had mutual respect for each other. We respected what each of us brought to the table. Sometimes we'd have disagreements, but we'd work them through. Interestingly enough, as she refers to in the book, there was a hierarchy, but it wasn't particularly pronounced. And we did great work together, and just a very small team of us. I think there was only sort of 6 or 8 of us. Basically built a kind of version of eBay, not quite from scratch, but over the course of about 9 months. In super productive way. So I think as I read this book, I had a sense of having experienced teams like this and knowing what it was like.
Yeah, let's say perhaps what we can do is just to start with the first part. And the first part, it's, let's say, the explanation is why fear is counterproductive. And as you also discussed with Amy in your podcast interview, Amy Edmondson has done a lot of research on let's say different catastrophes in the past, and shows that it would have been one would have been able to avoid those catastrophes if there would have been psychological safety.
Yeah.
And perhaps we can just take some of those examples. There are flight incidents with airplanes where people were not allowed to speak up. KLM, the Dutch airliner, as an example, at the Canary Islands, and then you can do some other ones where, let's say, pilots are sitting next to each other, and people are just not they don't feel safe enough to say, I think we're doing something wrong now, and then there's a collapse, or it ended in a catastrophe, and then she analyzes in these different topics what's the reason for that, and she did a lot of research in hospitals, for example. It's also a classical example, and in the book Fukushima is mentioned, and the space shuttle, etc. So that's where she comes from.
Yes, that's right. And so she, but one of the things that she actually starts with, which I thought was interesting, was that what she calls this sort of accidental discovery, that she was looking at error rates in hospitals. And she had this particular chart for assessing team effectiveness, a particular survey. And she expected to see a correlation between team effectiveness and the number of medical errors or mistakes in this medical setting. And she did find a correlation, but it was the inverse. She actually found that as team effectiveness went up, the number of errors also went up. It didn't go down, and this puzzled her. And of course, what she realized was that it was these effective teams were actually reporting much more of their errors. So there's that candor again. They were prepared to be candid, and actually they were doing the better job. They were just being much more honest about when they were making mistakes. And so that then sent her off down an inquiry into, what is it about teams and cultures that enables them to be honest with themselves and others? And that's what started her journey until ultimately, as you say, Google caught up with her.
It's also a lesson on statistics, huh? That's you can do a lot of statistic research, but especially if you ask people, we see exactly the same, that if you, for instance, install self-organization and you have much more freedom, let's say the reference point you compare with is totally different. So, right. And that's something which you here also see. So it's interesting, and that's also what she describes in your interview, or the interview she had with you. That she said, I found a correlation, and I thought, that's strange. But then if you dive into that, that's also, in a way, very logical. That if you feel safe enough, that you report more mistakes in the hospital, and if you feel unsafe, if you fear, then you say, I haven't seen the mistakes.
Yeah. And if you're in a situation where you've got, as she alludes to later in the book, if you're in a situation where you've got very high standards, and often medical organizations do have very rigorous standards and they're very well documented, but there's no psychological safety, you're in a kind of constant state of anxiety. And I guess, as any of us can relate to, when you're in a state of high anxiety, you're very unlikely to perform well, especially when it's complex. I mean, you can kind of grind through simple tasks even when you're anxious, but when you need to get creative and join dots and get playful, then there's basically no hope of you performing at a high level when you're in an anxious state.
Yeah, and then let's say that's the first part. So starting with the negative point of view, that is extreme examples. Fukushima is a very well-known example, or the space shuttle accident is a very well-known example, where in the end they found out people were not willing to speak up. It was not safe enough. Although then afterwards people said, I already had an impression something was wrong, but nobody said something. I thought, okay, perhaps my colleagues will speak up. And then the next part of the book is that she shows some examples of fearless workplaces, which is chapter 5. And perhaps you want to take some of those examples, Richard.
Yeah. So, I mean, one of the ones I like is the Pixar example. And I think this illustrates the fact that what she says right at the start of the book is that psychological safety is not about being nice, right? Because a lot of people might hear this and be like, oh, God, so what's this? All sort of come by let's find a consensus, everyone, and don't upset each other, right? It's absolutely not that. And they talk about the example of Pixar, of course, it has, a sort of stunning run of very successful movies. And they have this, Pixar, apparently they have a brain trust, and their job is to critique movies in development. And even just the language that the guy she interviews here describes, he says, all our movies start out sucking, right? Now, even just that illustrates like what a culture he's in. Like in how many other contexts could a senior executive, when interviewed by somebody from Harvard, tell them all our products start off by sucking, right? That in itself tells you kind of all you need to know really about the culture that somebody in a senior position can be that candid. And then how do they get them to not suck? Well, they have these processes where they critique the movies, and there are 3 rules. The first is you must be constructive with your feedback, which I guess is, I suppose, familiar to all of us, right? That's actually not in that interesting in a sense. We want to have suggestions, not prescriptions, right? And that's something we can, even I fucking find myself guilty of. It's like you want to jump straight to, okay, well, this is how you should do it. So they're saying, no, you don't do that. You might suggest, hey, have you considered this? Right? That's suggestive, framing. And this idea of the feedback should not be gotcha. So it shouldn't be, Tom, you screwed up. It should come from a place of empathy, right? So, okay, given where Tom is at that point in the process, right? Okay, I can understand why you might have done this or that, right? So that focusing on the empathy when you're providing feedback. So I thought that was a great example of like one way which sort of fearlessness manifests.
Yeah.
Did you have any like?
Yeah, there are some examples. Perhaps we shouldn't dive into all of them, but an example I like very much is probably on the other side of the spectrum is Barry Wehmiller, who wrote the book, or Barry Chapman is the person, and Wehmiller is the company, and he wrote this book Everybody Matters. So which goes very much into this being human, and he has a kind of buy and build strategy. So he also bought a lot of companies, but he never fired people. He says everybody is important, and there's this example of the bus, which perhaps people are familiar with in Jim Collins. Put the right people on the bus and take the wrong people out of the bus. And Barry Wehmiller says everybody deserves to be in the bus, and I just make an extra round, and in the end everybody will jump into the bus. Everything is fine. And he shows with all his companies that this deep human connection he makes with everybody works excellent. So he creates an enormous psychological safety, and everybody is allowed to join in its own speed, and not jumping immediately on the bus, but perhaps on the second or on the third round. I mean, you shouldn't be against something which is going on in the company, but he creates a kind of, he says everybody's family. It's a caring for your people like family. So it's another approach. I think is a very nice one, also because your podcast is called Being Human.
Yes, right. Yeah. I like that example. It does remind me of it's from a different book, but the Buddhist guy who set up the cookie company in the States, and his hiring his hiring procedure is you just a list. You just join the list, and when you get to the top of the list, you get hired, whoever you are.
Yeah,
right? Total faith in humanity.
Yeah, there are more of those examples. Huh? Also in the Netherlands, you also have one. So that they say we I think also a cookies company. They didn't create a company to bake cookies. No, to give people a possibility of being employed.
Yeah.
Because they have been in jail before or something like that, which is incredible, interesting way of seeing things. You not say, okay, I want to be a excellent cookie baker. No, I wanna give people a possibility to rejoin society. Excellent.
Yeah. And I think we'll probably come back to this theme, but I think what we're touching here is, there's a broader context here. It's not just about like how you interact with meetings and, your behaviors as a leader. And even your structures and processes. It's this broader, what's all of this founded in? Is it founded in like a deep care and respect for each human being in your company, right? Is that the basis of it? Because if it's not, anything that you try to put on top of that is not going to be as successful.
Yeah. And framing is, you have here, let's say, two directions. One framing is where we started with. So if you want to maximize output, or when you have if you would like to have the highest performance, then it makes sense to create psychological safety. And the other way is the more humanistic approach. You want to create a human environment because your aim is to help people. And that's also, if we refer to our book Small is Beautiful, this Buddhist economy, it's let's say, you wouldn't fire people because the social goal or purpose of the company is to employ people.
Yes.
It's another way, but both are ending up in this theme of psychological safety. And the third part is, and it's probably, I don't know if it's the longest part. Third probably, it's about creating a fearless organization. So yes. I don't know if you want to dive into that by starting, for instance, with the structures he creates, or.
Yes, well, I think perhaps it's useful. I mean, I know we're jumping straight to the sort of the end of the book, but it provides perhaps a framing of it. She talks about the leader's toolkit for building psychological safety, and then she breaks it down into three categories: setting the stage, inviting participation, and responding productively. When she talks about setting the stage, framing the work, setting expectations about failure. And that's a big theme in the book, right? Destigmatizing failure. That's a really important part of psychological safety. And in fact, I'm working with a client right now who just, through any means necessary, wants to excise any mention of the word failure from a set of slides we're preparing. And, I have empathy for his position, right, in the culture that he's in. That may attract some stigma. So, a big part of the psychological safety, destigmatizing failure, being comfortable with uncertainty, which actually links to a very common theme on the Being Human podcast, which is, this idea of complexity and embracing uncertainty. And then she talks about emphasizing purpose, what's at stake, why it matters, and for whom. Inviting participation. So asking good question, listening to others. So again, she's big focus on the sort of the human behaviors here. She talks about demonstrating humility. So, as me as a leader, if I can demonstrate humility to others, I got this wrong. We failed. I screwed up.
Yep.
That's a big part of this. And then setting up structures and processes, which maybe we'll want to dive into. Creating the right forums for input. What do good meetings look like when we're optimizing for psychological safety? Providing guidelines for discussion. And perhaps we can touch on the Ray Dalio example of Bridgewater in terms of how they do that. Express appreciation, listen, acknowledge, thank you. Again, that sort of touches into the care and respect for human beings. Destigmatizing failure, I've talked about, and sanction clear violations. So it's not all carrots. Apparently some sticks are necessary. So that's the way she breaks it down in terms of building a fearless organization from a leader's perspective. Any reflections on that?
Yes, what I wanted to take out one example which I like a lot, because it's, I'm a historian, so what I, for instance, like is this idea of, she calls it the powerful question or devil's advocate. And if you Google devil's advocate, you find out that in the Catholic Church, when they talk about or discuss about saints, if somebody would be a saint, somebody had to argue in favor of this person, but the devil's advocate was installed by the Pope to do exactly the opposite. And everybody knows devil's advocate, but there it comes from, which I didn't know, but I looked it up in Wikipedia. And for instance, in our company, we often discuss this, that if we all agree on something, that the last one should let's say argue against it, just for create a better decision making. It's kind of decision making tool, so to say, but it's very old, just to sharpen the, let's say, the process or the thinking in the organization. But it's, if you do this over and over again, and if it's a part of the process, then it feels familiar to argue against something, which is a way of installing psychological safety.
Right. Because people start to get comfortable with, these opposite positions being explored. Yeah. And that makes sense.
But it's also, if you study law, this whole culture of debating or debating societies is also that it becomes familiar in this environment, that people argue, let's say, in one direction or the other direction. And it's still done in Oxford. You can see, it's put online nowadays, that there is a kind of thesis, and then somebody says, okay, I'm in favor of it, and then the other one comes and says, I'm against it. And that's cultivating debate. And that's something which we at the moment don't realize that much. That let's say this process of debating is a neutral thing. So if we want to proceed, if we want to have a better outcome, or also if we want to respect each other or respect other opinions, it's very important to cultivate the debate culture, and not say, okay, I only talk to people who have the same opinion I have.
Yeah, exactly. And I think this draws into the broader debate going in society right now, is that we all live in these social media bubbles and we're only ever exposed to opinions we agree with. We also perhaps don't interact in we don't eat together in the same way that we used to, right? Kids are on screens, they're not having debates around the family table so much, right? It's almost like society's trends are mitigating against us being able to absorb and be respectful and explore opposing views. So, perhaps that's why, as a hypothesis, that's why this topic is coming to the fore right now, is because somehow it's been eroded by society at large. And when we sort of find each other in organizations, we're finding this more difficult than perhaps in our history, because of how society's evolving, how parenting's evolving, and so on.
Yeah. Perhaps you also would like to dive into this example of Google, because you also discussed this in the interview with Amy, which is in Sanction Clear Violations, and where it was about James Damore in this memo in 2017 about diversity, because I find it also interesting. So it's something which you see in companies, but you also see it in society at large, where the question is, if you have somebody who says, no, something is going in the wrong direction, somebody's more or less punished openly for that. Although people who speak up, doesn't matter in a company context or in a societal context, are people, you have to be very brave to speak up. Take Snowden as an example. It's also a very good example of psychological safety. Somebody's ruining his own lives for the benefit of the society, and this exactly happens in the company as well.
Or at least that's one position, Tom. There would be others who would argue the precise opposite, right?
Let's say that if you talk about psychological safety, so something's, if you say I mean, you can put it in a very simple way. I mean, if you talk about walk the talk, for instance, then we know that if we don't walk the talk, it is helpful, especially in the long run, if people speak up and say, "Hey, we're not behaving in the way we should. We're not walk the talk," and that's what something was happening. And the question is, how do you respond on that as a company or as a society? But it's in both cases, it's about psychological safety, because if we overreact on that, at a certain point, people don't speak up anymore.
Yeah, well, exactly, and I think it's almost like cancel culture is canceling psychological safety, right? At large in society, and we need to address it. Absolutely, I think we are. Many of our sort of leaders now, I think, are addressing the fact that cancel culture is a threat in many ways to society, and it's also true within organizations. And I think I keep coming back to this empathy. I think this is a sort of key part of this is can we separate the view, the position from the person? Can we explore why this person in front of us has this particular view? Can we get to the point where we could say, oh, okay, if I'd grown up in their circumstances, if I'd had their life experiences, if I were exposed to these set of risks and these set of opportunities, maybe I'd come to a position like that, right? That's something that I think is paramount in terms of us building psychological safety and building a set of skills, if you like, that allow us to create psychological safety.
Yeah, and what I find very interesting, because especially in this Corona or COVID crisis, there's also a lot of discussion going on about, let's say, the way we build our societies. Anti-fragile, what's the role of the state? Who is taking what responsibility? I mean, if we wouldn't have strong states at the moment, we wouldn't have survived the crisis, because most companies would have gone bankrupt, just as an example. So if you want to question, let's say, a lot of public institutions, it's a good time to do so, because at the moment we really need them. But one of the most interesting parts of the book I find is on page 202, is psychological safety about whistleblowing. Because you also asked Amy Edmondson about free speech, which is a more, I would say, decent way of asking the same question. And she says they demonstrate courage. And she says in companies, and she says then in companies, we'll come to society later then, in companies with psychological safety, whistleblowing should not be needed, because employee concerns will be expressed, heard, and considered. And I thought, oh, that's a strong sentence, because that means that if psychological safety is in place, you have the normal processes which are solving, let's say, the normal tensions, and you don't need whistleblowing.
Yeah. Well, that logically holds together for me, right? But it's not just about psychological safety, right? Because could you imagine a situation where you felt totally able to speak up? You had no fear of threat of your career, your status, all according to that definition, and yet the company itself was still doing something wrong, and that society at large might need to know about, right? So I can conceive a scenario where you could have high psychological safety in a company, and yet you still there still might be a need for whistleblowing. But generally, it would seem to me that you wouldn't really have that setup. People wouldn't need to go outside. I mean, I think if two things are true, if A, you've got psychological safety, and B, there are just ways to resolve issues within the company, then for the most part, you're never going to need to take your concerns outside of the company.
Yeah, but to take a very practical example, which is all over the place, sexual harassment. She also refers to it in the book.
Yes.
So if there is a safe environment, then people would be able to speak up. People don't have to quit and then go to the press and say, "Do you know what happened in the company? I kept some emails." is a very actual situation. I heard also about Bill Gates in a couple of days ago. So it's this topic is going on and going on. But if there is psychological safety, also this kind of topics, just would be discussed in a normal way and would be solved in a normal way. And they wouldn't end up in the press. And it also was in this Google context, which I find, let's say, very interesting. But there's also this aspect of radical transparency. So the more transparent stuff is, the better it is. But that's something we also know from democracy. So if it's clear who's paying whom for what reason, then everybody knows. So if let's say if you fund a political party, but it's kept as a secret, which is done, then it's much more difficult and creates a lot of tension. And here's exactly the same. So the more transparency you have in a company, the better it is.
Yeah. No, I think that makes sense. And there's the example, isn't there, in the Bridgewater, the company run by Ray Dalio, who wrote the book Principles. And he's a target for my podcast, or anybody who knows him. They record their meetings, right? They video and there's a meetings library online where people can go and see all of the see all the videos. And it reminds me of a story from the book. Is it one from many, right? The story of Visa by D. Hock, and he describes, and I love it. And he describes the situation of their annual board meeting at Visa, and they'd go to some Caribbean island and have their board meeting every year. And each year, the spouses were invited. Certainly in that era, I think we're all female, and the men and the board members are all men. And the one year they invited the spouses to watch the board meeting. And the change in behavior was remarkable, right? So the spouses didn't say anything; they were just observing, and they all behaved very differently.
Yeah, sure.
I just think the fact that that whatever your interactions are going to be made transparent to the rest of the organization in itself, supports psychological safety.
Yeah, and especially if you know that all the meetings are online, it's much more difficult to talk about other people who are not in the room. So if you have a problem or an issue with somebody, you should go to this person bilaterally and talk about it, because you wouldn't discuss it in a meeting and then everybody says, "Hey, listen to that tape. This colleague complained about you." So it's also an old rule that if you want to discuss something, you should discuss it with the person itself.
Yeah.
So
which comes back to care and respect, but it also comes back to what if we're going to destigmatize failure, what do we want to stigmatize? And Ray Dalio says he stigmatizes. He calls people in his firm, is it slimy weasels, who those who talk about others behind their backs. So it's sort of, we are creating a supporting morality around what we're trying to achieve.
What I would like personally to end with is on page 207. That's the last 2 pages. The question is, what about cross-cultural differences? Is it possible to create psychological safety in China, Japan, and you name the country here? And then what I find interesting is that she refers to a book of a Dutch professor, and it's a famous one. He is called Geert Hofstede, and the book is called Cultures and Organizations, Intercultural Cooperation and Its Importance for Survival. And she refers to it because she says, research shows that workplace psychological safety is lower in countries with greater power distance. That's nice, because let's say in her notes it says that the opposite is also true, or the opposite, not the right way of framing this, but it means that when there is a low power distance, it's much easier. So cultures with a lower power distance, it's easier to install psychological safety. Which I mean, she frames it here in the other way around. Is it difficult to install it in China, etc., which is from this American Western point of view or our Western point of view, it's dictatorship, so to say. So is that possible? But the other way, to ask the question the other way around, is also interesting, and I find it pretty sad. I would have liked to read much more on that, because if you see all this modern organizational developments about psychological safety, we know also from research that especially in the Scandinavian countries, where we have in general, let's say, a very low power distance, not only in the companies but also in the state. So let's say politicians are going by bike to the parliament, and so it's a very flat, so to say, flat society, not only flat organization, that these societies are much better equipped to install psychological safety in companies. And I would have found it very interesting because Amy Edmondson is a professor at Harvard University working in this American environment, where we talk about hire and fire, and we have a lot of also topics in society which are pretty unsafe, Black Lives Matter, etc., etc. It would have been interesting if perhaps your next book is on that broader topic. I would be very curious what the connection is of psychological safety in companies and psychological safety in societies.
Yes, that's right. And well, I think there's a number of ways that, I think what's interesting about the book is she's obviously discovered a phenomenon, and she's developed some hypothesis, in terms of, there is this correlation between psychological safety and various good outcomes. And then she's got some examples of companies where they've managed to achieve this, and she's put forward some hypotheses about how, given whatever company you're in, you might encourage in this. But yeah, she never really asks the question. She never zooms out, does she? She never really asks the question, okay, well, what are the factors outside of the organization that might mitigate, for and against psychological safety within it? It's almost feeling like there's a book begging to be written that looks at that, broader perspective.
Yeah,
and if it's true that companies do better and we as a society do better because the companies do better if they're more psychological safe, then what do we need to do as a society to encourage it?
Just to put it very practical, if you have a high, let's say, psychological safety around the company, so if you have, for instance, high unemployment benefits, if quitting the company as a last resort is something which is pretty easy, because it doesn't influence your own private lives, because you still have, let's say, your health insurance, you are still able to send your children to school or to university, because that everything is paid by the society, then let's say the end result would be that also it influences in an enormous way the way you behave in the company. Or if you have a low unemployment rate, it's easier to quit the company than you have an enormous high unemployment rate. And that's why there is a correlation between, let's say, changes in society during times where there is a low unemployment rate. So in the 60s, there was a lot of change going on in society. Why was that the case? Because we had full employment. But if you have an enormous chance of being unemployed and you have high loans or student debts, and you're risking to let's say you lose your health insurance, or you're losing your status, or you're criticized by your partner, how could you speak up in the company because our children have to go to university? You can't, to my point of view, you can't separate psychological safety in a company. You can't separate this from the societal context of it.
Right. So in some ways, you think the analysis is flawed from the start because it's tried to reduce it down to what's going on inside the walls of the company.
I don't know if she does, but it would be at least a very interesting discussion.
Yeah. No, that makes sense. What comes to mind is something I read once, a research about suit sales, and apparently suit sales often go up in a downturn in the economy, and that's because everybody feels like they need to impress their bosses more to keep the job. And I think that would make sense, right? You know, we feel less safe to express ourselves in Hawaiian shirts and T-shirts when, it's not looking too rosy outside.
But it's a very good example, because let's say this whole, flexibility entering the workspace, where did it start? In IT companies. So if you have not enough people, if people have a very strong position on the labor market, they say, no, I'm only going to work then and then. And the IT guys were the first who were able to enter the company buildings with the card and do the programming at night. And nobody cared if they were wearing white shirts, because there were just not enough of them. So they said, I'm only going to work there if I don't have to wear a suit. But all the other guys, no matter if they had contact with the clients, they had to wear a suit. So it's an excellent example.
Yeah, that's right. And this has been around since the start, from what I'm reading about the people who maintained the clocks, certainly in industrial Britain at the start of the year, or during the Industrial Revolution, were they were the ones who could get away with coming in late, coming hungover, right? Because they were felt so safe, right? That they were never going to get fired as being the guys maintaining the clocks, because that was such a prized job and it was so needed for the running of the factory. And yet there'd be people on the production line getting beaten if they were a minute late, right? So yeah, I think it's important that we. And
to end with a practical example, because we're living in the COVID crisis still, that the companies who tell their employees that they can stay at home forever are the IT companies.
Right.
I mean, these are not, and the old-fashioned companies where they would say, if you don't like to come back into the office, you're fired. That's exactly the opposite. So if you just would see the newspapers, or would you see what's going on, the remote working software companies, the GitHubs and Zooms, etc. of this world, or the Facebooks, they are telling their employees, doesn't matter after COVID. Doesn't matter where you are, just keep working for us. If you are in Bali or no matter where, as long as you keep working for us, it's okay. We don't care where you are.
Yeah, that's a very good point. And so then, of course, it begs the question, like, well, how do we keep it safe, no matter how prized you are by society? And that that becomes another question. Which again, which circles back to the power distance, and
that's correct.
Has a factor. Yeah, you're right. So I mean, I think in summary for me, all that said, I think there is in this some gems of wisdom and some observations of some great practices and some pointers as to where you might want to evolve your leadership if this is something that you want to manifest to a greater degree in your company. And I think it's also true that there is this much broader context which isn't really addressed in the book. Anything else?
No, I mean, I like the book a lot. For us, psychological safety is really the basis. So I admire also the research which is done on the topic. But I also would be very, very curious to see the more societal context of psychological safety.
Fantastic. Well, on that note, let's close this out. Thank you, Tom, once again for this next installment of You Should Read This. We'll put links to the book in the notes. And see you for the next installment. Thanks, Tom.
Thank you.
I hope you enjoyed this episode of You Should Read This with me, Richard Atherton, and my fantastic co-host, Tom van der Lubbe. If any of the material in this show resonated with you, if you're thinking, perhaps, how could I take these ideas and apply them in my own leadership or take them forward into my own organization, then I would love to have a conversation with you about that. If that feels like that could be a valuable use of your time, then please do click on the Calendly link in the description for this episode, and that will allow you to book a slot directly into my calendar. And I hope to speak to you soon.